George Caldwell absolutely needs no introduction in this place. A longtime member of the parish staff in retirement, is now back as a parish associate. I wanted to, even though he needs no introduction, just to introduce him to say that I want to thank him because in this interim time he is taking over the responsibility for the Sunday Adult Forum. So I want to thank him for that as well, and we look forward to hearing from him.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O Lord, our governor, whose glory is in all the world, we commend this nation to thy merciful care, that being guided by thy providence, we may dwell secure in thy peace. Grant to the President of the United States, the governor of this Commonwealth, and to all in authority, wisdom and strength to know and to do thy will. Fill them with the love of truth and righteousness, and make them ever mindful of their calling to serve this people in thy fear. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the Holy Spirit, one God, world without end. Amen. So, moral leadership and the presidency, the politics of character. To err is Truman, was the gag that was going around when I was born. To err is Truman, but it's all about character. It was all about character in those days, and it's all about character today. That's my presentation in a nutshell. As I looked ahead to this President's Day weekend, it seemed to me that we might want to spend a forum hour looking at the presidency, and specifically at the question of moral leadership in the office. That's a question that's not just current, but surely it's an aspect of government that ought to be of concern to us as a church. Those of you who were at the 11 last week will have heard me promise that I'm not going to take your time or test your patience by delivering a partisan political rant for our time together, tempted though I might be in light of what we're reading in the papers these days. Full disclosure here, one childhood day many, many years ago, when I came home from the old Glen Echo amusement park, which was across the river, with two presidential coins that I had won. One of Lincoln, the great emancipator, and the other of Eisenhower, who was our president at the time. When I came home with these coins and showed them to my father, he harumphed. "Two Republicans," he said. Well, I've generally wound up somewhere near the center of the political spectrum, though if you need to locate me, I suppose that I would say that the party of Trump is not my Republican Party to the extent that it ever has been, if that's vague enough. In any event, I'm not about political speeches. It's not my job. But I have to start somewhere. And what I want to start with this morning is a political fact. It's a political fact that as members of the church may well concern us. The fact I want to start with is this. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump won the votes of more than half of all weekly church attenders in the United States, more than half of all Roman Catholics, and some 81% of white evangelicals. Let me say that again. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump won the votes of more than half of all weekly church attenders in the United States, more than half of all Roman Catholics, and some 81% of white evangelicals. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. Popular anger at the extraordinary levels of inequality in our country, disappointment with Hillary Clinton that led some voters to sit on their hands, and the deceptiveness of numbers that may obscure the fact that some of those people who were evangelicals or Roman Catholic voters or or weekly church attenders or whatever may not have been voting as evangelicals, Roman Catholics, or weekly church attenders. They were simply voting from whatever position they were in society, the issues that mattered most to them. So it's a bit deceptive. But to me, it's suggestive of a long-term process in this country that worries me. That we, as a country, have lost sight of the role of our president as a moral leader, as a leader who gets good things done, who adopts goals and governs in ways that conform to moral standards. Granted, since the election, we're certainly being driven towards a greater appreciation for moral issues. But outrage at this event or that event, outrage at this policy or that policy, is not really what I'm talking about. I worry that as a country, we want effectiveness. And we're getting pretty tribal in our partisanship on both sides of the aisle. And I worry most of all that we're losing the knack for being clear-eyed in our assessments of the most critical ingredient in the moral leadership of the presidency, and that is the character of the candidates for political office. We don't want to take the hard look at people's character that we might once have done. We want to be tolerant, okay? And well, we should be. Mindful of our own character flaws, we don't want to be quick to condemn the character flaws of others, because condemning is not what we're all about. We are about love. Much more generally, what the pundits say is that over the past several decades, we've seen a cultural shift away from a focus on character towards a focus on personality and achievement. Who cares if they're morally good? We want leaders who get things done, or something like that. In a book on character and moral leadership, David Brooks, who I think is an insightful conservative commentator on our times, Brooks says that we've gotten attached to resume virtues, that is, achieving wealth or fame or status, and we've lost sight of what he calls eulogy virtues, those that exist at the core of who and what we are: kindness, bravery, honesty, faithfulness. From my own point of view as a preacher, I think we're losing the language to talk about character and to assess moral leadership. We're not really comfortable with words like virtue and vice. You probably won't have heard me in the pulpit talking about vice anytime recently. It's an uncomfortable making sort of word. So I worry that we shy away from moral assessment, from character assessment, from looking at a leader's character. Or worse, we allow ourselves to be shoved around by partisan attacks that masquerade as character assessment, crooked Hillary or Trump's deplorables or what have you. And that in the process, we just get thoroughly sick of the whole business and just hope that somebody nice comes along. But here's the thing. We are members of a community that is called to responsibility for our moral well-being, for the moral well-being of our families, for the moral well-being of the society in which we live. Yes, God is wholly good and we are not. But that doesn't absolve us from responsibility for trying to assess the character of those we elect to lead us. Now, when even people who should be comfortable with words like virtue and vice are shying away from moral discernment, I think real trouble looms on the horizon. More full disclosure here. I am, I suppose, in many respects a theological liberal. But at times when I feel the ground getting a little shaky under my feet, I sneak back quietly in my imagination to the Baptist church of my Missouri-born grandfather to hide for a little while, humming Rock of Ages or In the Garden can do you a world of good sometimes. If there's a voice to the church of my childhood, it's probably not the English accents of the various Anglican churches that we attended as I grew up overseas, but rather the Carolina accented warmth and sincerity of Billy Graham, who we listened to on the radio. So I find it crushing, and I worry for the future of the church when I hear Billy Graham's heirs giving our president a mulligan, a do-over for those of you who do not commit golf, giving our president a mulligan for behavior that doesn't bear talking about where children are present. For us churchgoers from a generally broad church tradition, moral language, the language of sin and of character, among other things, can have a slightly medieval ring to it. But is it irrelevant? Should we shy away from it? Of course, we have to be aware of our own flaws and to keep in front of us what the prayer book calls our mortal nature, our own distance from God. But I'm okay, you're okay, so let's just argue about policy just isn't good enough. Let me put it just a little bit more strongly. It's President's Day weekend. It's also Lent. So let me ask you for just a moment to reflect on the newspaper headlines of the past year or so, while I name some of the traditional understandings of what unhealth looks like in soul and society and what health looks like from the church's point of view. So, is what you're seeing out of the White House these days humility? Or is it the sin of pride? Is it kindness? Or do you see the sin of envy? Is it patience? Or is it the sin of anger? Is it diligence? Or do you see the sin of sloth? Charity? Or the sin of greed? Temperance? Or the sin of gluttony? Is it chastity? Or is it the sin of lust? Well, Jimmy Carter was the last president to try and talk about lust, and he didn't do so well out of it. So here's one of those points where I could segue into one of my rants. I'm not going to. Humility and pride, temperance and gluttony, chastity and lust are virtues and vices. They are matters of character. You see in there the 7 deadly sins, and I'm inclined to think that they do have pretty direct relevance to what we're seeing in the daily news. Now, I'm not trying to put us at odds with the spirit of gentle forbearance and constant nudges towards compassion that marks this parish and that we deeply prize here. We're not about coming up with a preachy, medieval-sounding language of condemnation. We're about the language of God's love. But that loving includes naming the places where human flaws are obscuring and leading us away from what we believe God intends for us. Character, vices, and flaws, and strengths and virtues don't have to sound medieval. The comparatively new science of positive psychology lists traits that we might all aspire to and look for in candidates for the presidency. Things like wisdom, knowledge, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, an appreciation of excellence, hope, and humor. Moral leadership takes strength of character. And we need to look for strength of character in our political leaders. Without character strength, without virtues, moral leadership isn't going to happen. So, look at history. From the outset, our greatest presidents have exercised moral leadership, and their strengths of character have been easy to discern. Parenthetically, it's only fair to say that the character flaws of some and their failure to provide moral leadership have been equally easy to discern. Well, I want to talk for just a few minutes here about some of these great presidents. In doing so, I'll be talking largely about virtues, about character strengths, about the foundations of moral leadership. If that omits vices and character flaws, well, I think the times may call for reminding ourselves a little bit of the positive side of things. So I'll begin with Washington. It's nearly his birthday after all. He was, in many respects, our greatest president. The Constitution, those of you who have studied American history and read the Constitution know the Constitution doesn't actually say a whole lot about the presidency, about what the office is and what a president should do. So Washington, in many respects, defined the office, and he did so in ways that have served this country well. When he took the oath of office as president, Washington repeated the scripted words about defending the Constitution. But then he added his own. He said, "I swear, so help me God." Every president since has repeated his words, but not all of them have possessed his moral compass. Joseph Ellis, some of you may know, a historian and author of a wonderful biography of Washington, remembers growing up right here in Alexandria, watching the annual parade down Washington Street to celebrate the great man's birthday, and taking advantage of Dollar Day sales that honored the man whose face appeared on the dollar bill. National hero that Washington was, though, Ellis writes that the man himself seems aloof and silent, a little hard to figure. Franklin was wiser than Washington, Ellis says. Alexander Hamilton was more brilliant. John Adams was better read. James Madison was more politically astute. Yet each and all of these prominent figures of the Revolutionary era acknowledged that Washington was their unquestioned superior. Why? The answer, in Ellis's judgment, was Washington's character. The cherry tree story is a fable. It's a fabrication. But what we know of Washington's moral life is that it was a long and determined struggle to master himself. Washington was physically imposing. He was very tall for the age. He was emotionally restrained. He was mentally somewhat enigmatic. But most of all, he seems to have been a man of genuine humility. He was called to command the Continental Army, to chair the Constitutional Convention, and to assume the office of the presidency. In each case, Washington denied any interest in the office, the appointment. He demeaned his own qualifications, And he insisted that only a unanimous vote left him no choice but to accept. We can, and we're likely to be, a little cynical about this today. But Ellis says that the truth is more complex. Washington, he says, struggled. He struggled to acknowledge his own ambitions and to keep them in check. He was a man of character. One story that I've cherished since I heard it many years ago takes us to March 1783. The pressures on Washington were enormous. The weakness of the new federal government and the grievances of an unpaid army came together to prompt rumbles of a coup, a military takeover of the government. Washington needed to tell his dissident officers that his assuming dictatorial powers would be a repudiation of the principles that they had all fought for. So on March 16th, he entered a large auditorium where some 500 of his officers were gathered. He went to the podium. Some of you may know this story. He went to the podium. He reached inside his jacket to pull out his prepared remarks. And then he paused to put on a pair of spectacles. No one had ever seen him wear these on a public occasion. "Gentlemen," Washington began, "you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Overdone? You had to be there. And you have to understand the respect that Washington commanded. Several officers began to sob. All thought of a military coup died at that moment. That's moral leadership. That's character. A footnote on Washington's character: he had hoped to live into the next century. But on December 12, 1799, he rode the rounds on his farm in a driving wintry mix, as we would call it today. Returning, he chose not to change his soaking clothes, get this, because dinner was ready and he didn't want to inconvenience his guests. He died 2 days later on December 14th of the chill that he contracted. His last words were hopeful. "'Tis well," he said. And his last act, mastering himself to the end, was to feel for his own pulse as he died. So then, to Lincoln. Where do you start on the character and moral leadership of one of our greatest presidents? Not even mentioning that he died, he was assassinated on Good Friday, and that his life takes on Christ-like tones in some respects. Actually, I would start with Lincoln's humor, because I think it draws us to his humanity. Lincoln, well, this story was told that in the days between Lincoln's election and his inauguration, one of his ardent supporters pledged to prevent any interference with his taking the oath of office, even if it cost the last drop of his blood. Lincoln responded to this hot-headedness with a tale about a young soldier leaving for battle, whose sisters had made for him a belt on which was embroidered "Victory or Death." "No, no," the young soldier protested as Lincoln told the story. "Don't put it quite that strong. Make it victory or get hurt pretty bad." Humor. Then honesty. He was not called Honest Abe for nothing. It was a name that attached to him from the time that he clerked for a store in New Salem, Illinois. He never dishonored the reputation, wrote an early biographer. Lincoln was judge, arbitrator, referee, umpire, and authority in all games and matches of man flesh and horse flesh. A pacificator in all quarrels, everybody's friend, the best natured, most sensible, the best informed, the most modest and unassuming, the kindest, gentlest, roughest, strongest, best young fellow in all New Salem and the region round about. His junior partner in law said of him that he never yielded in his fundamental conception of the truth for any man or for any end. Humor, honesty. Third, biographers point to Lincoln's reliance on reasoned argument. Robert Shogan, the author of a book on moral character and the presidency, contrasts Lincoln with Andrew Jackson, who vented his outrage whenever he felt threatened or scorned. Who vented his outrage whenever he felt threatened or scorned. I feel a rant coming on. Lincoln, Shogun says, relied on reason. He relied on reason to keep a lid on his sometimes chaotic emotions and to keep his ambitions in check. Lincoln's faith is yet another thread in the complex weave of his personality. Precisely where he stood on matters of doctrine and church would be worth a forum on its own. But this we can say, prayer was a constant in his life. One of the worshipers at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church once summoned the courage to ask Lincoln why he stood for prayer, while all around him others followed the custom there of sitting in the pews for prayer. Lincoln explained, "When my generals visit the White House, they stand when their commander-in-chief enters the Oval Office. Isn't it proper then that I should stand for my commander-in-chief?" I would add, finally, that Lincoln, much after my own heart, was a master of words, of simple, clear, precise speech that used evocative phrases to move people and bring them along with his moral vision. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said in his first inaugural. Some of you may know it. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." That's character. That's what moral leadership sounds like. Oversimplifying then, more than a little, if Washington's moral leadership was founded on character strengths of self-mastery and humility, and Lincoln's on honesty and humor and reason and the soul of a poet, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was all about courage and hope. Confidence and courage came naturally. It came easily to FDR. He was born rich into one of the country's most elite families. He believed that he was destined to lead, like his cousin Theodore. "Whenever a Roosevelt rides," a Republican elder once said, "he wishes to ride in front." Well, they were different men. TR was an excitable bully, according to a presidential historian named Jeremy Suri, who has a wonderful book, incidentally, just recently called The Impossible Presidency. TR was an excitable bully. Where FDR was calm, he was nonchalant, he was inclined to listen and to charm. TR loved to fight. FDR was conflict averse. For Franklin Roosevelt, politics was about bringing antagonistic groups together. and using all of the resources of government to give the greatest number of citizens an opportunity to participate. Roosevelt had financial security. He believed that others should have the same. He did share in the common belief of the time that some are born better than others. But he wanted to increase the opportunities for all to rise from their different starting points. His was a politics of hope. Safety and security required the assistance of others. Roosevelt's personal ordeal with polio reinforced that point. Many opposed him. He overreached. His moral leadership failed, notably in a number of instances, in the internment of 100,000 American citizens of Japanese descent without due process during the war, or in his refusal to support anti-lynching legislation that would have antagonized Southern Democrats whose votes he wanted in the Senate. But he was not, Suri says, a know-it-all with ready answers. He was not a bragging warrior promising to overcome all demons. What he had was authenticity, an ability to build trust with millions of citizens who had reason to disbelieve. He had authenticity, and that's character. That's what moral leadership felt like. He looked and he sounded different from many Americans. He was our last president, if you've ever heard a recording of FDR speaking. He was our last president to speak with the old patrician accent. But people pulled over on the highway to hear his words when Roosevelt came on the radio. So, what is character? What is character, this foundation of moral leadership? Well, very briefly, we are what we repeatedly do, says the philosopher. Our character is the sum total of our moral habits, what we do when the chips are down. And character shapes our destiny and the destiny of presidents. And we might well be about the business of asking ourselves for any candidate for the presidency, what are the moral behaviors which we have seen repeatedly in the life and work of this person? What is the content of their character? We can get distracted, we can focus in. I live in my head a lot, okay? And so I tend to value knowledge. And I cringe sometimes during presidential debates. But Truman, Eisenhower, Reagan, we now know that they were a whole lot smarter than they sometimes let on. But regardless, being smart, I have to tell myself, doesn't necessarily make you good. Without habits of humility, of honesty, of self-control, of responsibility, of courage, of compassion, knowledge doesn't mean much. And of course, the apparent absence of both is more than a little worrisome, but I'm not going to rant. We are drawn these days to celebrities. But celebrities are distinguished often by the fact that we don't really know very much about their character. Celebrities are often people who are famous for being famous. Character is key. One of our greatest presidents, for my money, was not president at all, but First Lady. A lady of great character. More of Eleanor Roosevelt some other day. Lastly, a couple of words of humility and caution. Character is key. Character is the key to moral leadership, but it's no magic bullet. One of the presidents that I enjoyed reading about in preparing for this forum was Jimmy Carter, a man of unimpeachable character, whose inflexibility and the sheer bad luck of things that happened during his presidency doomed his chances of being considered one of our great presidents. Woodrow Wilson might be considered in the same category. And then there's the fact that the modern presidency is a crazy-making place. Scholars of the presidency call it the impossible office. Stuff comes at the president at an unrelenting rate and in a bewildering variety. In my own time working in the White House nearly 30 years ago under Bush 41, the tempo there seemed more than unforgiving. There was no time to think, to plan, to set priorities. Stuff just kept coming in the door. But with that said, with those words of caution, character remains all the more the key to moral leadership, and overlooking it will cost us bigly. Let me stop there and ask you if you have questions or comments. Jerry.
Yeah, just a kind of an aside on Washington, because I think we have a tendency today to take today's moral codes and today's feelings and judge these people who lived at a different time in a different environment, especially when it comes to anything that has to do with sex, anything that has to do with money. Washington and Hamilton, as you know, made the Great Compromise. Hamilton agreed to move the capital from Philadelphia to the Mount Vernon area, where he understood Washington had a few pieces of land. And in exchange, Washington, after 15 years, decided to support the National Bank, which is the heart of our banking system. The day after they made that compromise, Washington wrote a missile, a letter, to all of his overseers saying, I have reason to believe we will be able to increase the tariff on our swamp property in the near future.
Washington was an astute businessman. And actually your point reminds me of something that I would add. When you talk about we look back now to a different era, and we have trouble getting our minds around with firm judgment exactly how people were. And here, the issue that I'm thinking of, in the same spirit that you were talking about, is slavery. Okay, so Washington famously freed his slaves in his will, okay, but he did not free the slaves prior to his death, despite realizing that slavery was totally at odds with the revolution that he had fought. And when you read Washington's kind of outlook on slaves, as he was from day to day, you don't always see high moral character. Sometimes what you see is practical business sense. He had 300 slaves on his various properties. Of those 300, approximately 100 were actually working. There was another 100 who were too young. They were just children. And there was approximately another 100 who were too old and infirm. And basically what Washington was saying in one of these letters was, this is not a good business proposition. I am responsible for 300 souls, only 100 of whom are working, you know? There are these, you know, how do you get your mind around that? When Washington died, his personal sort of manservant was there in the room. You know, in some respects, it's a sign of Washington's nature that he turned to his slave and asked him to sit down, because he realized that the poor man had been standing. So, okay, here's a gentleness and here's a regard for others. But on the other hand, it was his slave. And Washington, by the standards of our day, should have done something different. It's also, it's fair to say that when you wrestle with these kinds of questions, there is a school of historical scholarship that looks back and wants to poke holes in Washington. There's another school that I'm probably guilty of myself that puts him up on this pedestal, and here's this great man. Truth is somewhere in the middle. But my point today was just simply that when we look for moral leadership, I think we need to become more clear-eyed in our assessment of the character of the people that were elected to the office. But thank you for that. It's a really good point. So,
a question. The value of character in and of itself being as powerful as it is there any, are you thought about the extent to which that character translates into any form of valuable policy? Abraham Lincoln, with all of his virtues, the Civil War started the day after he was inaugurated. So, are there any guarantees that great character brings great results, or is it just a value in and of itself?
no, it's a value in and of itself. In my mind, and again, I'm talking sort of from my own background, I tend to worry a lot about what presidents do in a crisis. I spent my secular career working in intelligence and worrying about warning senior government officials about stuff that was coming down the road, and sometimes we only gave them like 5 minutes warning. Sometimes we didn't warn them at all, and it just plain happened. And I think character is very important for what presidents do when they have to respond off the cuff. I also think that you can find examples in history, and that's one of the reasons I picked FDR. I think there was a genuine commitment to people and to trying to lift the country out of a depression that arose from his moral character. That was not just, I am a policy wonk, I've done the analysis, and I think all things considered, we ought to have the following policies and institutions and so on. I think there was a genuine kind of moral impulse there. So in that respect, I think character is directly relevant. But two things. One is that, as I mentioned very briefly, there have been presidents of unimpeachable character in whom their values contributed to an inflexibility and an inability to deal in the Washington context. And Wilson's pursuit of the League of Nations and all the rest of it, a long and complicated story, but I think it's a case of inflexibility triumphing over what might have been a better outcome in those circumstances. I had a thing I was going to add to it, but can't for life remember what it was. I'll come back. Yes.
When I look at this, one feels helpless to a certain extent. When we live in a society where greed and celebrity are worshipped, I think there is, how do we, even if we possess what we perceive to be the correct moral compass, the art of justice bends toward truth, but it takes a very, very long time. How is the effort spent, other than by example? And how do we get from where we are now to a better place?
I would sort of recite the familiar, we become better voters, and we get smarter about the character of people we elect to office, and so on. I'm going to be kind of old-fashioned here, and I hope this is not off-putting. But years ago I was associated with the Society of St. John the Evangelist, the order in Cambridge. And I think if you had asked the superior when and I was there, Father Paul wasn't there, you know, that question, he would have said, you pray. You pray for our country, you pray for our president. You know, the more prayers, the more the atmosphere in the country changes. And that may sound a little old-fashioned and tricky, but there are practical things that we can do about fulfilling our roles as good citizens. But there are also things that we can do as members of the church community. It was surprising to me when I was reading about the moral and spiritual lives of the presidents, how many of them found occasion to pray. Who went to the New York Avenue Presbyterian or to St. John's Church or to wherever it was, or who had pastors coming. Lincoln, the pastor of the New York Avenue Presbyterian, was a regular visitor. So anyway, it was Karen.
Well, when did you say the beginning of the downward spiral away from character? I'm thinking about who we know, Kennedy and the president of Kennedy and Nixon.
Johnson, Nixon.
Johnson didn't have. I felt sorry for him. He was not in, but the one I can't think of, I should have never asked questions, but the one that Monica Lewinsky did.
Clinton.
Yeah. So they were pretty good, pretty smart, Rhodes Scholar, blah, blah. Yes, I guess they speak to your talk today.
The two answers. I was surprised when I started looking, started research this topic, that there are a whole spate of books on character in the presidency, and they started during the Clinton administration. So people started worrying about this topic when, and Monica Lewinsky, but also, this was Slick Willie, right? This was, we had our questions about Clinton's character. From my perspective, he was a politician without peer. As a politician, as a human being, not so much. But I leave you with one either encouraging or discouraging thought on this question. You can go back to Nixon, and if we had a lot of time, I'd just love to, talk about fancy. I can get started on Richard Nixon. So you can really go anywhere, and don't let me leave you with the impression that all people aren't mixes of character strengths and character flaws. We will all have both. But the thought here that I have, I worked one time, the funnest 3 or 4 years of my career. I worked in an office that did analysis of political leadership on the basis of personality assessment. And we would look at events, if Saddam Hussein has just invaded Kuwait, is he going to go further? Is he going to go into Saudi Arabia? Well, one way is for the military folks to look and see where he's got, how he's got his tanks aligned and that kind of stuff. Mike, if you're back there somewhere, you can tell me a whole lot more about that than I know. But our job was to say, well, what kind of a person is he? How does he think? One of the people that I worked with gave me a rule of thumb, which has been very helpful to me. He said, you look around the world, and the number of people who would like to be the leaders of their country is enormous. Lots and lots of people would like to be the president or the prime minister or the king or the whatever. But the number of people who actually make it is quite small. It's tiny. And so he said, from a psychiatric point of view, those people who actually make it must be different from other people. They must have something about them that's just unusual. So in the context of this discussion today, I guess what I'm saying is, yeah, the people who actually become president are extremely this or extremely that because they did make it somehow to the top. And one of the things that we need to do is to look at the balance of factors that got them. And so, I think Clinton is not a bad place to start among people who had an extraordinary mix of characteristics, some good, some not so much. It's 5 minutes of 11. Thank you all for coming.